Hey guys, Alex here from TitanBearGaming.com, at TitanBearGaming on social media. We're about halfway through the month of February, which means we have a new Unearthed Arcana to take a look at. This month is called Into the Wild, and it is an interesting additional set of rules for Dungeon Masters, most importantly, but players will definitely get some benefit from reading this. Now, this PDF, Into the Wild, does talk about the concept of Overland Travel, right? And Overland Travel is defined as anything where your players are moving from a town to another town, or if they're moving from a town to a dungeon somewhere out in the wilderness. Something where it's going to take multiple hours to actually get there, or more likely multiple days of travel to actually arrive at some place. This is as opposed to talking about the concept of travel inside a dungeon, or inside a ruins, or inside a city, or something else, where you're making decisions based on walking out the northern door, or going out the window towards the east, or something else that's more tactical along these lines. This PDF tries to talk about how when you're dealing with overland travel, it's fundamentally different than when you are talking about travel inside a dungeon or inside a building of some kind. Now, the material of this Unearthed Arcana is intended to be kind of an overlay on top of the rules that already exist in the Player's Handbook and in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, the rules for overland travel, as they already exist in the Dungeon Master's Guide, are pretty specific. It specifies a pace that your adventuring party is going to move as you move across the world. A lot of Dungeon Masters like to use hex-based grids for this, or they just do it purely in theater of the mind, and they just specify that there's a certain number of days of travel to go from one place to the next place. And it all gets a little bit hand-wavy, and it mostly comes down to the individual Dungeon Master's interpretation, or the individual Dungeon Master's personal style for how they like to do overland travel. And that's where I think that this PDF is actually very helpful. I think that there's nothing ground-shaking in this. There's nothing that's terribly wild or terribly crazy, but it does help to provide an extra level of description and an extra level of detail for, in particular, new Dungeon Masters that may not necessarily have a decade worth of experience to draw from for how to actually play through the concept of overland travel. So the first thing that this PDF introduces is this concept called the navigation DC. And it's funny that they describe it as being introducing this as a new concept, because we've had this concept of navigation before. It mostly just lands on a survival check for being able to determine if you get lost or if you lose your way or something like that. They introduced this concept here called the navigation DC, where they basically say that for each day of travel, your party has to make a difficulty check. They have to make a navigation check to see whether or not they can successfully navigate to their destination. And they do provide this interesting table that talks about what that DC should look like based on the criteria, or based on the characteristics of where the players are trying to go to. For example, if your destination that you're going to has a well-marked path or a road going from start to destination, there's no need to make a survival check, right? That there is no navigation DC for that. You just automatically succeed since you're just walking down a road. But if there's no path and the destination is in a open area, an area that's not particularly difficult to navigate and you can see very easily, the navigation DC starts at only 10, right? You just make a survival check against a DC of 10, and you can probably find it most of the time. And then it starts to get worse. The DC goes up to 15 if the destination does not have a road and is in some kind of dense terrain, like a forest or a mountain or something like that. The DC goes up to 20 if the destination is no road and it's relatively well hidden, and some kind of conscious mundane efforts have been made to hide the place as much as possible, right? Reducing the number of entrances or exits, putting a cover over it. Maybe it's underground or in some kind of very thickly shrouded dell or something. The DC goes up to 20. 25 is the DC when you add some kind of illusion magic or other kind of a magic to help protect the place and help make it harder to find. And DC 30 when you're using really powerful magic or you need some kind of otherwise specific key or something to be getting in. This is an interesting concept to add a level of direction and specificity to when players are making some kind of survival check to find their way there. The recommendation as far as the PDF is concerned is every day of travel have someone who is navigating in the party. That's the next piece. It talks about different roles that people in your party can play as you're making this kind of overland travel. Whoever's making this, make one survival check against the navigation DC once per day to see if you're actually going to get there. If you don't get there, if you fail your DC, then you become lost or you stray from your path or whatever. They don't provide a whole lot of information about when you become lost. They specify some things about 2d6 miles in a random direction or traveling in circles or whatever. but it's not really terribly impactful. I think for the most part, you can internalize when players deviate from the path, or if it takes a little bit extra time for them to get to their destination. Now, one thing they do specify in this is that for random encounters, if you're going to be using a random encounter table or some other kind of concept of incorporating random encounters into your game, if the players do become lost on any given day, it says to roll twice to have an increased likelihood of accidentally stumbling upon some kind of monster's lair or being further into the wilds than a more traditionally traveled path would otherwise result in. The PDF then talks about mapping out the wilderness from the Dungeon Master's perspective, specifically talking about the idea of spending a moment to think about what kind of regional details would be relevant and would manifest visually and from a sense of smell and from a sense of sound, sense of hearing perspective, just to help add a level of effusiveness and to give it a little bit better detail and description into your traveling experience, right? Because while you're doing this, you're not just saying, okay, you move one day towards your destination, roll again. You move another day towards your destination. No, that's terrible roleplay, right? What you want to be doing as the Dungeon Master is describing the scenery that the players are moving through and what kinds of natural effects are around them, what kind of landmarks are around them. Are they passing by any towns? Are they finding people? What does the landscape and scenery look like? And so that's what this section talks about. It talks about assigning potential adventure locations within the region that your players are going to be moving through, thinking about regional effects from your monster manual, if there's going to be any kind of large, high CR rating monsters that have some kind of regional effect. Like a lot of the dragons have a regional effect and vampires have a regional effect and whatnot. This is a good spot to think about that and to start incorporating that into your description of your environment. As the Dungeon Master, you might want to have your players make some certain skill checks while they're going through that are kind of related to travel, but more specifically are related to the characters finding themselves in a new environment, right? You might want to have them make a history check to try to find a forgotten road or identify the origin of a ruins that they're walking past, maybe a nature check to identify what kinds of wildlife, what kind of flora and fauna might be existing in this region based on tracks or based on droppings or based on some other kind of observable evidence in your immediate vicinity. And of course, one of the most popular ones being making additional survival checks to avoid natural hazards that may exist in the environment, like quicksand or poisonous plants, things you don't want to eat, stuff like this. Now, this is about when the PDF starts getting away from the concept of overland travel and starts to delve more into the idea of making a more rich environment, a more rich description for the region that your players are working through. And fortunately, I think that actually they communicate the things that they're trying to promote, the things that they're trying to suggest here. They communicate it best by simply providing you with an example. They have this example region called the Moon Hills with a little city that's in it and some terrain features that are going to be about it, which are actually kind of nice. Now, first it talks about the mood that you will find as your characters are walking through the Moon Hills. And it's interesting. They describe the Moon Hills as being this rugged series of steep hills with a city called Fallcrest in it, that there's very heavy influence from the Feywild, the Shadowfell, and the elemental plane of Earth in this region, which is cool, and it provides kind of an interesting thematic aspect. It talks about how for the Dungeon Master, you should try to play up the hills and jagged cliff faces that are present here in this region. That makes travel through the area feel a little bit like walking through a maze. You're not really going to find much in the way of straight or easy paths here, which will complicate your navigation DCs whenever you're trying to walk around through this vicinity. It talks about how the presence of elemental earth is actually a really big thing. There's going to be a lot of boulders and crags that are showing up in places that might seem otherwise inexplicable, like they've fallen out of the sky. One of the things that they describe as being very prevalent here in the Moon Hills is having a lot of inroads or pathways between the Shadowfell, the Feywild, and the elemental plane of Earth. And so we have kind of this weird concept of these things all infusing themselves into the environment and changing the environment that the players are walking through. It talks about the maze-like nature of the vicinity, making it kind of difficult to navigate, as well as making it very ripe for bandit opportunities or highwayman opportunities, since they can be hiding behind a crag and be able to ambush upon somebody very easily. It also talks about throwing in a few ruins or dungeons of various kinds. It talks about undiscovered vaults of this old city, of this old kingdom that used to be here, megaliths being raised by druids that have tunnels and excavation chambers underneath them. Some kind of interesting things like this to help dot your landscape with some slightly more interesting information than just plenty of trees and plenty of rocks. Some things your players might actually be interested in going to go take a look at. Now, the last section talks about actually exploring exploring the region, the physical terrain. And this is what I'm talking about, I think does a better job explaining what Wizards is trying to communicate with this PDF than any of their directions. So take a look at the case study specifically. I think that it helps to convey the details a lot better. For example, we have this nice little summary here for Moon Hill saying that navigation is harder. Your base DC all the time is a DC 10 for your navigation DCs, simply because things are so steep and windy and very craggy, and you're going to be walking through a lot of narrow channels and whatnot. It specifies your base foraging DC, that it's easy to find water and light game here, so your foraging DC is only 10. Cool, that's great for when your characters want to try to find some food in their natural surroundings. And it specifies a special rule here, which is that the presence of the Shadowfell and the Feywild have a close enough proximity to the prime material plane here that if you spend a long rest here, your players have to roll on what they call the planar confluence table, which is very cool. There's a table here for your navigation DCs for any of the individual ruins or settlements that we talked about earlier, that if your players want to try to go find these things, if there's no pathways in between them, what would be the navigation DC? That's specifically listed here so that you can arbitrate that easily when you're at the table. And anytime that the players make a long rest here in the Moon Hills, they have to roll a d20 on this planar confluence table, which is kind of cool. On 1 through 16, there's no effect. On a 17 through 18, you have disturbing visions and you only recover half of your spent hit dice, which is not the same as half of your maximum hit dice. So your rate of recovery for your hit dice is slowed down a little bit by having some disturbing visions as a result of the Shadowfell influence. If you roll a 19, the Feywild influence comes in and grants you vivid, exciting dreams. You gain inspiration simply for taking a long rest here in this vicinity. And if you get a 20, then it says the Earth influence that is here in this region fortifies and strengthens flesh and bones, gaining temporary hit points equal to your character level. So it adds for kind of an interesting bonus or reward or penalty, as the case may be, simply for taking a long rest in this vicinity. This is the special rules for this region. I like having this as a established precedent for when you are writing a new region that your players want to go into, just because it helps to add a little level of specialness and a little bit more excitement to running an adventure in this space. And then lastly, they talk about the terrain features that you'll find here. And this is interesting. The text doesn't do a very good job, I think, of explaining what the purpose of this is. They talk about how the point of this is when you are dealing with tactical combat, when you get down to your battle grid and you are dealing in 1-inch squares and you're moving your miniatures around and you are in initiative-based combat, what kinds of terrain features could be present in that combat space, right? It's entirely boring to play a combat space in a wide open field with no features of any kind, right? In the Moon Hills, if you're going to be getting into some kind of impromptu combat or some kind of planned combat, there's a list of things that you might want to define as the dungeon master before you get into it to help add a level of life and a level of thematic consistency to your combats that you find here for the Moon Hills or whichever region you're pulling together yourself. The suggestions are 1d3 plus 1 steep hills with gullies that have paths between them, so you can have some uphills in your battle terrains. You can have scattered trees. You can have a boulder field, which has it has strength checks associated with it to either leap across the boulders or to climb up the sides of the boulders to really mess with and limit your paths of movement during a battle. Ruined Watchtower, the influence of the Shadowfell comes in. All characters and monsters, if you do this, but all player characters have disadvantage on death saving throws while they're in the area. That's a pretty gnarly one. Or the Feywild influence, that you have disadvantage on wisdom saving throws in the area. I would probably also go backwards on that and start throwing in some positive characteristics like having some additional hit points or something else along those lines, but you kind of get that from the planar confluence table anyway. So that's about it for the Into the Wild PDF here. It's an interesting read. Like I said, there's nothing terribly impactful, nothing that's terribly wild in this PDF. I think that it's a worthwhile read for any dungeon master, especially the dungeon masters that like to really sink their teeth into how do they tell the story of players moving from one place to the next, right? A lot of this game can boil down into just being dungeon after dungeon after dungeon or dungeon after city after dungeon. And you should have some storytelling that goes on in between each of these individual locations. This is useful. I don't think that I would use any of this directly as is, but when I'm reading this kind of material, stuff that I think goes a little bit too far into the simulationist aspect, I like to read it anyway because there's probably going to be some kind of bits and pieces that I can take from a narrative perspective, weave into my own personal style as I'm telling my story and as I'm playing through my game. And there's going to be some pieces in here that I particularly like, right? I like the idea of having your navigation DCs giving a little bit more information about what kinds of characteristics would result in a higher DC. I like the idea of having a little summary table for each of the regions that you're going into, covering the basics of what navigation looks and feels like, what's difficult versus what's not when you're trying to navigate around in this region, what your foraging DC is gonna look like, and what kind of special features are gonna come for that. And are there any other kind of regional rules that might apply, like the planar confluence table here for having the influences of the different planes coming in whenever your characters are making a long rest. I like having that kind of short little summary. The rest of it, I don't know, I'm okay on it. Let me know what you think. Leave me a comment down below about this. Let me know what your reactions are and how much of this you think is going to be helpful for you running your own game. Last week on Monday, we announced a new giveaway, which is kind of a partner giveaway that I'm doing with a fellow YouTuber named Mr. Tarask. Be sure to go check out that video. I'll have the link in the description down below. All you got to do to get any book of your choice, any D&D book of your choice, is to just sub to the channel and leave a comment on that video. I made a video and put it over on his channel, so we have kind of a paired video thing going on, so be sure to enter into that. Also last week, I was on Nerdarchy's live chat last Wednesday. You can head on over to Nerdarchy's YouTube channel and you can see me hang out with Dave over there and just have a little conversation about D&D and kind of the Titan Bear Gaming board game store and some of the things that we have in mind for the future. And also last week, I did a collaboration video with a Kickstarter by Windmill Slam Games called On the Shoulders of Heroes. This is a D&D campaign setting that's got a very Viking feel to it. You can check out that video. I do a little bit of a sneak peek talking about my favorite player race that they add for their campaign setting, as well as a couple of the magic items that I thought were particularly well written. Be sure to check that out and also check out their Kickstarter. As of right this very moment, they're at like 99.5% completion for being backed. So they've pretty much already made it. And it's a really nice campaign setting. I really like the art style. Go check out the video. I show some of the clips from the book and some other nice things about it. We have a couple of the new things that I'm adding here for being able to talk to you guys through different avenues. The first is we're going to be booting up a Discord server so that we can have some longer form chat conversations about D&D. Sometimes it's not quite so easy having a conversation about D&D or something about your specific campaign or a game that you're playing in or something through Twitter or through Facebook or whatever. It can be kind of difficult to butt up against those mediums, and Discord makes that a little bit easier. So we're going to be firing that up. Keep an eye on our social medias for when we're going to be announcing that and making that publicly available. Next week, we're also going to be doing our first live stream over on Twitch, where you can just come and hang out with me and Frank, and we can shoot the shit about board game store stuff. We'll be opening up new shipments as they come in. We can open up board games, do some kind of unboxing and impromptu unboxing for things that you guys want to see, as well as just talk generally about board games, the stuff that's coming in, what's new, what's going to be coming out in the near future, etc. We might even be doing some live plays there so you can watch me beat Frank at board games. Now lastly, if you like what we're doing here on the YouTube channel, there are ways that you can help make sure that I continue to do these. I continue to make videos like this going into the future. The easiest way is to head on over to TitanBearGaming.com and buy something from our store. We sell all kinds of great board game stuff, RPG products, dice, miniatures, modeling paints, pop collectibles, funny foam dice and plushy dice toys, novelties like that. All kinds of great stuff. We also have a Patreon account. We are over on Patreon. You can find us there at Titan Bear Gaming, just like anything else. And any little bit of donation that you can make goes a long way. We are pretty new at this, and so any additional amount of support that you can provide to us does help keep us making these videos and helping to bring good content to you. Otherwise, you know the usual. Leave a comment down below, like the video, subscribe to the channel so you can see when I'm putting out new stuff. You can come talk to me over on social medias at Titan Bear Gaming on basically all platforms. I'd love to talk to you over there. I think that about does it. Until next time I see you, have more fun, would you? It's good for you.